How are we persuaded to change our attitudes and behavior? Let's start by defining the concept of persuasion. Social psychologists define it as the process by which a person's attitude is changed. It's a daily occurrence for most of us. For example, students asking for extensions on assignments, children asking for snacks, bosses asking us to stay late, politicians trying to win our vote, companies trying to sell you a product or service. This process is a two-way street in the sense that we try to persuade other people, and they try to persuade us. As you can probably guess from the length of this video, there are numerous sub-processes involved in persuasion. We'll take a look at some of these next. One such process is illustrated here by the dual process model. It says persuasion is the outcome of three factors: the characteristics of the source, the message, and the target's or audience members. It also says we process information using different cognitive processes, the central route and the peripheral route. The route we use depends on our willingness and ability to analyze the information and think carefully about the argument. If the source speaks clearly and concisely, if the message is relevant and important to us, if the audience is engaged and cares about the topic, if they have ample time to absorb the information, they'll probably use the central route. They'll think carefully and rationally about the message and will be influenced by the strength of its argument. Attitude change through the central route requires us to be receptive and open to change, to elaborate and scrutinize the message, and then to accept it. Keep in mind, though, that thinking carefully does not equal accuracy or objectivity. We often hold beliefs that are based on inaccurate or incomplete information. If the source speaks too quickly, if the message is trivial or too complex, if the audience is distracted or pressed for time, they'll probably use the peripheral route. It involves the use of mental shortcuts, rules of thumb, and minimal effort. Persuasion using this route, then, is influenced by superficial factors like the attractiveness of the source and attitude-irrelevant factors. For example, the study of attitude embodiment effects suggests our attitudes are influenced by our physical position, orientation, and body movements. In one study, people rated objects more positively when they were standing on soft carpet than when they were standing on hard tile. In another study, people who were coaxed into nodding with their heads were more likely to eventually agree with the argument. This figure lists some of the variables that influence the persuasiveness of a message, including the source's credibility and likability, the length of the message, the discrepancy between the message and the existing attitude, fear appeals, the audience's positive emotions, the audience's need for cognition, the audience's tendency to self-monitor, and the audience's culture. Let's explore these in more detail on the next slides. The first factor is the credibility of the source. The most credible sources have two distinct characteristics. One, competence or expertise. People who are knowledgeable, smart, or well-spoken, or who have impressive credentials, tend to be more persuasive than people who do not have these qualities. For this reason, persuasive speakers usually begin with a brief explanation of why they are an expert on the topic. 2. Trustworthiness. People who are perceived to be honest tend to be more persuasive. Unfortunately, stereotypes can influence who we perceive to be trustworthy, as we can see in Table 6.1 from the textbook. It shows the results of a Gallup poll in 2003. People were asked to rate the trustworthiness of various occupational groups. The most trustworthy occupations were nurses, doctors, pharmacists, and college teachers. The least trustworthy were lawyers, stockbrokers, insurance salesmen, and car salesmen. In part, because the self-interest rule applies to these occupations, they all have something to gain from persuasion, a paycheck, and may be biased in their argument. An interesting phenomenon worth mentioning is the sleeper effect. When we receive a message with a discounting cue, such as a non-credible source, we tend to become more persuaded over time. Essentially, the effect of the message sleeps and awakes later to produce attitude change. The second factor is the likability of the source, which is impacted by the similarity between the source and the audience, as well as by the physical attractiveness of the source. Similarity tends to enhance persuasion, while dissimilarity tends to inhibit it. For instance, you would probably be more persuaded by a fellow classmate or student from SIUE than a student from another campus. For this reason, persuasive speakers identify the similarities between themselves and their audiences. In addition, the more attractive a source, the more persuasive they tend to be. One of the first studies to investigate this variable was published by Kassin in the late 1970s. Male and female research assistants approached other students on campus and introduced themselves as members of an organization that wanted the university to stop serving meat in the cafeteria. Then the assistants asked the students to sign a petition in support of the anti-meat movement. More than 40% of students signed it when asked by an attractive assistant, compared to about 32% of those asked by an unattractive assistant. The length of a message also makes a difference. When the central route is used, the length of the message is a double-edged sword. If the argument contains strong and relevant points, a lengthy argument tends to be more persuasive. However, if the argument contains weak or irrelevant points, a lengthy argument can be less persuasive. Note that when using the less effortful peripheral route is used, longer messages need to be valid in order to be persuasive. The extent to which a message is different from our existing beliefs and attitudes influences its persuasiveness. The most attitude changes tend to occur at moderate levels of discrepancy. Too much or too little is not as effective. Fear-based appeals can be persuasive when the argument is strong and when the message presents coping instructions for the audience. This strategy is used by religious cults, public health organizations, and even politicians. One of the reasons it's effective is because fear is a universal primitive emotion that signals danger. It scares people into changing their attitudes. The emotions of the audience also predict attitude change. When we're happy, we tend to rely on the peripheral route of persuasion. Why? There are a number of explanations. Good moods distract us from thinking critically about the message. Good moods provide an opportunity to be lazy processors of information, and good moods are spoiled by critical thinking. One study found that people were more likely to be persuaded when they snacked on peanuts and soda than when they didn't. This effect can also be induced by comfortable seating, upbeat music, breathtaking scenery, and laughter. The audience's need for cognition, or the extent to which they enjoy effortful cognitive activities, predicts attitude change as well. People who score high in this need like to solve hard problems, search for clues, make fine distinctions, and analyze situations. They are more persuaded by information-oriented arguments. On the other hand, people who have a low need for cognition are more persuaded by peripheral-based arguments. Here are a few sample items from the Need for Cognition scale by Kassin and Petty. Take a moment to pause this video and review some of the items to familiarize yourself with this concept. The audience's tendency to self-monitor also plays a role. High self-monitors regulate their behavior from one situation to another, out of concern for public self-presentation. They tend to be persuaded by arguments that appeal to images of social desirability. Low self-monitors are less image-conscious and behave according to their own beliefs, values, and preferences. They tend to be persuaded by information-oriented arguments. And the final factor we'll consider is the audience's culture. To be persuasive, an argument should appeal to culturally shared values. For instance, persuasive ads in individualistic cultures tend to emphasize personal benefits of products, while ads in collectivistic cultures tend to emphasize the group benefits. Now let's explore the concept of forewarning, when we know ahead of time that someone is going to try to persuade us. With issues that are important to us, we are more likely to resist attitude change when we know someone is trying to persuade us. One reason is because we have time to develop counterarguments. The inoculation hypothesis is the idea that exposure to weak versions of a persuasive argument increases later resistance to that argument. Another reason is because we're motivated to protect our freedom to think as we choose. Psychological reactance is a theory that we react against threats to our freedom by asserting ourselves and perceiving the threatened freedom as more attractive. We have various strategies for resisting persuasive communications, as we can see from Table 6.4 in the textbook. These strategies include attitude bolstering, where we reassure ourselves of supporting facts, counter-arguing, where we play devil's advocate and consider the points of the other party, social validation, where we rely on the agreement of other people, negative affect, where we get angry or frustrated when people try to change our attitudes, assertions of confidence, where we declare our resistance, selective exposure, where we ignore all or parts of the message, and finally, source derogation, where we minimize the credibility of the source. Before we end this section of the lecture, I want to make a note about subliminal messages. While we don't have solid evidence that subliminal messages influence behavior, researchers have created unique ways of testing their hypotheses. They produced evidence that we do perceive subliminal cues, but they do not usually persuade us to act unless we are primed and already motivated to do so. For instance, in one study, subliminal thirsty messages were more persuasive to people who were thirsty compared to those who were not. Now you know more about the process of persuasion and how attitudes change. In the last part of this lecture, you'll learn more about cognitive dissonance and how it impacts our attitudes and behaviors.